Welcome to the Urbe Ad Astra Bonus episode 2.
Hello, welcome to the Urbe Ad Astra podcast.
Hello, I'm Jo Walton, science fiction and fantasy writer and vocateur reader.
And I'm a diploma historian, also a writer. We're doing a special episode where we are going to share with you guys a game that Jo and I enjoy playing together quite a bit, although it's somewhere between a game and a literary conversation. Ada describes manga to Jo, and Jo compares them to novels she's read. We talk about gender and age categories in the marketing of publishing, and we talk about the translation, especially of sound effects. We talk about the influence that organized communities of fandom can have on the evolution of the publishing of a medium. We talk about moe, which is a very complex and interesting element of the marketing of anime that has to do with economic stability. And then also we talk a lot about gender and the effect of e-publications and e-readers on both simultaneously broadening and narrowing the specificity of the marketing of fiction. I read a whole lot in a medium that Jo doesn't and that many people don't, which is manga. And Jo and I really enjoy discussing the manga where I describe to her what the manga is doing, not with a trying to get her to read manga, which she doesn't. But because it's fascinating to just discuss a whole world of literature that's doing things that are similar to but different from the things that Jo reads in prose all the time. Because it's important to remember, lots of people sort of think of manga as a genre, but it isn't. It's a medium, like television or cinematic film or puppet play theater. It's a medium in which you can have any genre. And so there are dozens of different genres that happen in manga form. And so it's really neat for Jo, who reads voraciously in many different genres, ranging from SF, which she's best known for, and some fantasy, but also, chick lit and romance and mystery and all different sorts of genres, to then get to hear the similar but different thing that genre ends up doing when it's in a different medium.
Yeah, I find that absolutely fascinating. And there's two things. There's the different medium, and there's also the fact that it is Japanese, so it's coming out of that culture. And the people who are creating it have read and are often in conversation with Anglophone science fiction and fantasy. But Anglophone science fiction and fantasy are not listening to what they're doing. So it's feeding in but not out sometimes. And that's kind of interesting as well.
So we're going to talk about manga, but very much in the same way that, if you have a friend who's into opera or into skydiving or who breeds ferrets, you might ask them about it. They might tell you about their hobby, and it's very interesting, but not in a trying to get you to also breed ferrets kind of way. And I think a lot of people who don't participate in a particular medium will often be wary of discussions of it because they're wary that it's going to be proselytizing, that people are trying to persuade them to do it. This is not that. Getting skilled in consuming a new medium takes a lot of effort. You have to put a lot of experience points into building up the skills of consuming and understanding it. There's super legitimate reasons why lots of people would choose not to do that with any particular medium, just as many of us choose not to watch a lot of opera or watch a lot of ballet, and other people do choose to invest in watching opera or watching ballet. And just as some operas are fantasy, but many operas are not. So similarly, some manga is fantasy and many are not. And there is a kind of exchange, just as there is with opera, where Wagner has some influence on fantasy, and the way Wagner is then performed has some influence coming back from the way fantasy has developed since Wagner wrote the original scores. So in the same way, it's just interesting for anybody who's interested in science fiction, fantasy, or in fact just in literary genres in general, to hear about what's happening with them in a different media without me in any way trying to persuade people to, start breeding ferrets. to start consuming manga in a serious way. So what we're going to do is that I have a sack of manga which were just returned to me by somebody that I had lent them to during COVID. And so it's a bunch of different unrelated manga series in random order. And as Joe and I discuss them one by one, I'll describe them to Joe, and then we'll talk a little bit with each one about what other comparable or not comparable things are happening in that same genre in the medium of prose as opposed to in the medium of manga. And in some cases, the premise will just be so hilarious that also it'll just be fun to hear about it.
I think this would also be fun and interesting for people who do like manga.
Yeah, shouldn't make it
So
sound like
if you do like manga, don't switch off.
Yes, although there might be some spoilers here and there because I'm going to talk a lot about structure of things and so on.
Yeah.
So starting in what happens to be the top of the pile is a manga whose English title is Umi Nako When They Cry, which means seagulls when they cry, or when the seagulls cry, which is a series that is the sequel to or partner of the better known Higurashi When They Cry, which is the cicadas when they cry. These are murder mystery time loop series. In which at the beginning you encounter a bunch of characters and then they all get violently murdered. And then you're back at the beginning again and the events go slightly differently and then they all get violently murdered in a really radically different combination. And it loops over and over as you're sort of figuring out the structure of, okay, something is happening that is making this murder spree occur, but it's really hard to figure out who's the culprit and who's not, because like everyone gets killed in it in different orders in the different iterations as you gradually try to figure out the supernatural cause of the murder sprees, which is actually somewhat independent of the characters, and a different character will get pushed over the edge into being the killer by the supernatural phenomenon in each iteration, which is how there can be no consistency in who the killer is, even though there's consistency in the cause. And so the victims can be totally different and backwards each time. It's a very interesting structure, which takes advantage of it, plays with the fact that when we have a cast of characters murder mystery where people are getting bumped off one by one, we're sort of using the, oh, that person got killed, they must not be the culprit metric. And then iteration 2 or iteration 3, you're like, oh, I can't use that metric. I have to think more complexly about what other people did that I didn't catch earlier that caused that person to become the killer in that iteration.
Are time loops very common in manga? Because I know you've mentioned things with time loops to me before, and there's something that isn't very common in written science fiction and fantasy.
I would say no, they aren't very common in manga. They're more common, I would say, in Western comics. Not the looping over and over necessarily, but the having events and then going back and having characters interweaving amongst those events while other events happen. I would say the signature version of that I think is most influential and that to some extent influenced this is the old X-Men, Days of Future Past, and other related arcs that involve characters from a horrible dystopian future coming back in time to prevent it. And then characters from a different horrible dystopian future coming back to change the manner in which those characters stopped the horrible dystopian future so that it doesn't turn into the other worse horrible dystopian future. And so that has a double time travel arc where we experience the same event effectively 3 times. There are multiple versions of this in different media. So I would say that it's something that comics have played with in a way that I think is more common than prose. And I think one of the reasons for that is that one thing you can do when you're having a time repeat, very trivially when you have visuals and with much more difficulty when you have text, is that you can reuse the image that was there before, but with the addition of the new person or the addition of the slight change. And using that method lets readers instantaneously anchor themselves in, oh, this was the moment when, this character was in that room and leaned over and picked up that object, but in the background, this thing is different. And it's much harder to do that subtly in prose, because if you're describing a person doing something, you have to pause and describe it. You can't
Yep.
sort of do it trivially in the background of other things. So I think that repeated time is something that visual media does more effortlessly. And that is a bigger challenge with prose, where you have to think through, okay, I could just literally repeat this sentence that describes this thing, but readers don't like that. Or I could try to describe it in a way that makes it clear that it's similar, but makes it be different enough that the reader is still interested. Those kinds of challenges, I think, mean that it's explored a little more in visual media.
That's very interesting. I mean, I can think of instances where prose media does it in ways that are absolutely delightful,
Mm-hmm.
like R.M. Melluch's Merrimack series, where I never think about the time loop in those books without getting a big grin,
Mm-hmm.
because I just love it, love it, love it. And I did it in Lent and it was very hard.
Mm-hmm.
But most of the examples that I'm thinking of are indeed visual, like Groundhog Day
Mm-hmm.
and the movie Run Lola Run, which
Mm-hmm.
actually sounds a little bit like this one because that involves people dying
Yeah.
and then being alive again when you go back
Yeah.
through the loop trying to figure it out.
And the other one I can think of in visual media is the classic Doctor Who episode Meglos, notable for having the main alien villain literally be a potted cactus with a voiceover. who
Yeah, never change.
who trap yes, Doctor Who, may you never change, who traps the Doctor and the TARDIS and Romana in a time loop for 20 minutes toward the beginning of the episode. But again, you get to reuse visuals in a way that I think is less challenging than, okay, I'm using prose. Prose needs to constantly be fresh. And, even when people read Homer, for example, and Homer has repeated formulaic phrases, some readers say they get put off by that. And a translator has to work hard at it. Some translators of Homer, in fact, do translate the repeated formulaic phrases differently every time, which pleases modern readers in certain ways. Others want to bring forward the fact that this is a repeated formulaic phrase and will therefore translate it the same way every time. But this is a plot element, regardless of whether it's science fictionally caused or fantastically caused, which lends itself to being easier in a visual medium. The other thing about the Umineko and especially Higurashi series that I find myself unable to move on without describing, just because it's a fascinating thing to know exists as something that can affect publishing structure, and possibly, Joe, you and I can also have an interesting discussion of our knowledge of genre book publishing and parallel circumstances. Is that Higurashi is a example of moe. Moe, I have trouble finding a noun for what it is, because it's not a genre. Because you can have moe manga, which are fantasy, you can have moe, which are science fiction, you can have moe, which are slice of life, you can have moe, which are comedy, you can have moe, which are horror. It's a style. If I wanted to compare it to something, it's almost an aesthetic. It may be comparable to steampunk, or to goth, which is to say that a wide variety of things, stories, art, etc., can be sort of in that style, and it's partly narrative, but it's also substantially visual.
Or what about noir? Would noir be a
I would
thing
say
that you could
noir,
compare it to?
yeah, I'd say noir would be very much that too. And note that
Right,
noir has sort of signature, it's often mystery, but it doesn't have to be. Um,
right.
but it's sort of oddly narrower than that. And having given that sort of preface, I'll now describe what it is. Moe is a formula in which your characters follow a certain extremely rigid structure, in which the main character will be a 14-year-old schoolboy with short, brown or black, extremely average and mundane looking hair. Who will be one of only two male characters surrounded by a group of female characters of the same age, though usually with one a year younger and sometimes with one a year older, each of which will also fall into a formula. One of them will be the pushy, bossy, sort of teasy girl. One of them will be the quiet, smart, aloof girl. One of them will be the klutzy girl with big breasts. Often one of them will be the sweet childhood friend who usually lives next door. One of them will be the a year younger and very childlike girl. And sometimes there's a year older, more mature, kind of icy and aloof girl, though sometimes that's the same as the quiet, smart girl. And then there will be one other boy, and he will be a sort of friend of the main character, but some sub-element of the structure of the story will make it be that he is in no way a rival to the potential romantic partnering of the main boy with any one of the given girls.
Wow.
That is the formula. Note how rigid it is. But you can have that formula, and they're in space, and they're,
Yes, you could tell any story, but with that formula.
Exactly. Now, the thing about this formula is that when you make a moe, there are hardcore fans of moe who tend to, in fact, specifically be hardcore fans of one particular one of these archetype girls. They'll be hardcore fans of the sweet childhood friend girl, for example. And when you make a moe, this is in Japan, those Japanese moe fans will buy the $200 statue of her and will spend on the pillowcase and the art print and and buy the expensive DVDs. So when you make a moe show, you know you will make a certain very predictable minimum amount of money, because the moe fans will buy the amount of the merchandise of the characters that they normally buy. When you make any other type of anime, you're gambling, because you don't know whether it'll be a hit and have a big audience, or whether it'll be unlucky and be a flop and get very few viewers and sort of go nowhere. And your studio can be really hurt by investing heavily in something that is a gamble and then a flop.
So, are you saying that a moe, even if it's a flop, it'll make that money?
Exactly.
That the fans will buy any figurine of any one of those girls they're into,
Right.
from any moe, however terrible.
Exactly. And the quality will have almost no correlation, because what they actually care about is the character design more than anything else in a lot of ways. This is a bit of a complicated oversimplification of society and stuff. But the net result is that when you make a moe, you know you will have a minimum of X viewers and you will make a minimum of X money, and you can the studio can reach out ahead of time to the people who make the art statues and the people who make the art prints and the people who make the other merchandise and say, we're making a moe, we'd like to pre-license to you to do the thing in return for you ponying up some of the starting funds for the cost of making the show. As a result, a moe is a much smaller gamble for a studio than other kinds of anime tend to be. So, when the market is risky, more moe gets made, because studios want to be cautious and they want to have a backup plan and they don't want to take big risks. So you can graph the economic pains of the last 2 decades. The 2008 crash, the 2011 and 2012 crises with the tsunami. There's this spike in moe and this drop in non-moe right afterward, when the studios are being extra cautious and being extra careful. But what it means is that a lot of moe shows are actually that the author had a really awesome idea for, oh, I want to do a cool time loop murder mystery. Hey, anybody, would you please produce my time loop murder mystery? Nobody wants to produce my time loop murder mystery. Ah, what if it's a moe time loop murder mystery? Ah, yes, we'd love to produce a moe time loop murder mystery. And so there's a lot of moe, and a lot of it is very shallow. But there's also some moe that is brilliant, that just sort of happens to be being moe for budget reasons, uh,
That's amazing.
in order to get themselves produced. The other sub medium that works like this actually is porn. That sometimes somebody who has a really cool idea for a science fiction anime film will pitch it to studios, and the studios will reject it, and then they'll say, well, what if we do this, but it has 3 sex scenes in it, and you can market it as porn? And the studio will say, sure. And so there are a couple of anime with very interesting science fiction going on, notably A Wind Named Amnesia, which is a film about Earth has a thing zap the Earth so that suddenly all humans have complete amnesia, except for one guy. And then it's his observations of the world as he travels around, and nobody knows anything, and nobody knows how to use tech, and nobody has language, and sees what kinds of new relationships develop in this strange apocalyptic landscape. And then there are random sex scenes for no particular reason. The reason being, he was able to get the studio to give him the budget to produce the film in return for that promise, because when you make porn, you get a certain number of people who will buy it because it is porn, just as when you make moe, you'll get a certain number of people who will buy it because it is moe.
Amazing. Okay, how old are the people who identify with these characters and buy the dolls?
They tend to be significantly older, and indeed, it is one of the topics of conversation about the healthiness and unhealthiness of the degree to which anime characters look really young.
Right.
And it's also worth noting that this is a formula which was born in the mid 90s. Moe as this formula. And one of the major shapers of it was, in fact, Neon Genesis Evangelion, which, as I've talked to you, Joe, about before, is a really
Mhm.
brilliant and innovative work of SF, as well as a brilliant deconstruction of giant robot anime. But it also had a cast of very original characters, but they were the very average looking boy and the
Oh, right.
bossy girl and the quiet girl and the strange friend who in weird ways isn't a threat to the thing. And in many ways moe was born of that show being so influential and those characters becoming so popular that they were then morphed into crystallizing into this formula, though those archetypes existed elsewhere as well. And this is 1994, 5, mid 90s. And is a major turning point, actually, in the history of animation fandom in the US. And this is the arena in which one of the best secondary source essays on manga available in English is the afterword essay to the English Dark Horse edition of the unfinished single volume Seraphim 266613336 Wings, written by Mamoru Oshii, and or the manga is done by Mamoru Oshii and Satoshi Kon. The afterword is by Carl Gustav Horn, and it discusses in it the development in animation consumption and animation fandom in Japan versus what we can recognize in a modern sense as anime fandom. Because as animation was gearing up as a major industry, which began in the later 60s and then flourished in the 70s and the 80s, there were fans in Japan of animation. And there were magazines of this fandom, which you can compare to the magazine of a science fiction fan or the magazine of a fish keeping fan. And they covered animation globally. So they covered Japanese animation, but they also covered Disney films, and they covered when animation was being experimented with in Brazil, and they covered Russian animation, and they covered American animation that was all sorts of things. So not, beyond Disney, as well as covering what was happening in Japanese animation. And the people who read these and identified as this fandom, which had get-togethers and conventions, identified themselves as fans of animation. For which the word anime is the Japanese word for it, and it's a import word just by shortening, the word
Hmm.
animation. But then in the moment when this formula and crystallization of sort of more and more anime starting to have not necessarily the full moe formula, but 14-year-old protagonists and being sort of youthfully oriented, there was a split in which fans of just sort of that style, fans of anime in the this is also teen oriented sense, or sometimes about teens, even if it's actually aimed at an older audience sense, split off from the sort of broader world of animation interest. So, for example, as in the essay he uses to crystallize this, one of the things that the fandom had done, which was very interesting, was identify young Japanese animators. Mamoru Oshii and Miyazaki were two of them, who seemed to have really cool ideas for films, but weren't yet sort of authoritative enough to get in the position to get to be the director of a film and do their film.
Right.
And the fandom through their magazine would fund commissioning that person to do a manga as if it were the sort of storyboard for the movie that they imagine they might make. And this wouldn't be published the way normal Japanese comics are published in manga magazines. This would be serialized as chunks in the Animation Collector magazine. So that at the back, after all of your articles about Disney's films, would be, and here is the sample of the imagined film of this aspiring, ambitious, cool young filmmaker who we are paying to do this. And then this will probably, hopefully, help launch that person's career because studios will see it and get excited by them. So that was a commissioning of a manga that was really intended to be a film from the beginning, unlike most of them, which are the equivalent of a book. But so Mamoru Oshii and Satoshi Kon and Miyazaki had relationships with this and with animation. But in the year that the very famous Ghost in the Shell film, the first one, the one that was a major release in the US and hugely influential on US cyberpunk, and for many years was actually the most influential in the US Japanese work because it had a widespread theatrical release, unlike most of these things, and not much was being translated yet. That was the work of a director that this fandom had like nurtured and launched and been excited by. And in the month the film that came out, the cover story in their magazine was Evangelion again. Because there had been a shift between when those directors were young and upcoming and by the time those directors were actually making the film, the fandom had changed and the fandom had moved and the fandom had morphed into focusing on moe, whereas consumption, right? Because we all know consumption is very different from fandom. The people who buy a fantasy novel are very different from the people who actually go to the convention, which is a small subslice. The viewership of anime was going up and up, but this particular sort of gathered together, interconnected community of fans that had been dedicated to global animation shifted to instead much more focus on moe. So a very interesting sort of fandom history and then shift in a fandom causing reception to shift. But this is also why the protagonists and main characters in anime before 1994 basically are much more likely to be grown-ups. There's still some with grown-ups made now, but the vast majority are going to have teen protagonists. Very young protagonists are the dominant mode of animation coming out of Japan or produced within Japan for Japan. And that hadn't been as true before. It was much more common to have, mature adult women like Bubblegum Crisis, for example. An interesting shift.
Yeah, a very interesting bit of history.
Mhm.
Yeah.
And a glimpse of how a fandom can influence the evolution of an art form multiple times sequentially in different manners at different points.
Yes.
Which also, I realize, introduces a helpful term for the next one in our random stack, although I also noticed that we only got through one in, in half an hour.
Yes,
Is
we'll try to go quicker.
No, I don't know. Oh, they're interesting. They're interesting. We can do another one if we want.
Yes.
Four useful terms to know for discussing and thinking about this, and this again relates to publishing and thinking about the differences with the gendering of US publishing. And I'd love, Joe, for you to also talk about chick lit versus women's fiction versus romance, which are interesting elements that connect to this. So there are four categories in which manga, meaning the comics, are released in Japan, plus like weird alternate things that like the ones that happen in the back of a magazine or as a little enclosure in a CD-ROM box, and ones that are published in odd places. But for the ones that are published in, monthly manga magazines and then collected into books, they come in four categories. The four categories are shonen, which means boy or young man, meaning ones that are marketed for a young male demographic. Shoujo, which is young woman or girl, which is the for younger girls demographic. Seinen, which is for adult men. And josei, which is for adult women. And the words just mean boy, girl, man, woman. But within manga, they're used for this differentiation. Now, these are marketing categories and they don't mean a genre, and they also don't necessarily mean that that is the actual reader or even the actual target. It's the marketing of a particular magazine. Magazines will be either shonen, shoujo, josei, or seinen. And when you're trying to pitch your title to be serialized somewhere, you pitch it to one of these four. And it means that you're going for their gendering and their adulthood level. But it doesn't necessarily mean that you're writing for only that audience, because, for example, the single manga magazine that has the most readers, period, is Shonen Jump, which is the biggest boys collection. However, the manga magazine that has the most girl readers, the most actual buyership of girls, is also Shonen Jump, which is a shonen magazine, but lots and lots of girls read it. And so shonen, for example, is dominated by being marketed at boys, but it knows it has female readers, and it'll have female targeted fan service sometimes in addition to male targeted fan service. It knows that this is happening. But they're marketing categories, and the marketing categories determine an enormous amount about what the authors are sort of expected to be discussing and what kinds of tropes and formulae and even character models they're supposed to be using, and are gendered despite everybody knowing that plenty of men read women's stuff and plenty of women read men's stuff. But they are categorized into these four big categories, with josei, the one for adult women, being the one that is hardest to get a hold of in the US because of the lingering women don't read comics. Oh, young girls read comics, huh? But adult women still won't read comics expectation. Although in the last few years we've had a lot more of them.
Is that a US expectation rather than a Japanese expectation?
It's a US expectation.
Right.
Because in
Okay, just
Japan, manga is a very widespread medium and has stuff for all age groups. Anime tends to be much more geared for teens and younger consumers, partly because of this stuff that was going on in the mid 90s. So that there is an association between anime and kids, to the degree that sometimes when animation is not aimed at a teen audience or a kid audience or a teen audience, really, because like Miyazaki movies, some Japanese people that I'll converse with about manga and anime will say, but Miyazaki isn't anime because it's aimed at the whole family, not doing teen stuff. So that desire to sort of draw a distinction between the stuff that is aimed around this teen centric world, which corresponds to shonen and shoujo manga, and many such anime are based on shonen or shoujo manga, but there are also anime that are based on novels and animes that are based on ancient epic poems and anime that are totally original stories, so they aren't always corresponding to a particular category. But the marketing of the categories is very distinct, and they have distinct formulae, possibly best exemplified by the unique moment of the Escaflowne franchise, which was a anime. It's a very straightforward portal fantasy. You know, the girl gets swept off to a magical fantasy land where there are knights and kingdoms jarring with each other, although the knights fight in giant robots, but the giant robots are shaped like chivalric suits of armor, and the whole thing has a very chivalric suits of armor era feel. And the anime is hard to pin down as to whether it feels like she's the protagonist or Vaughn, the main male potential love interest character, is the protagonist, who's the prince of the conquered kingdom. And when they made the animation, they also made two different manga versions of it. One following her point of view, published in a shoujo magazine, and one following his point of view, published in a shonen magazine. And each of them has a different art style, which is more characteristic of that type of manga, and it's sort of a different pacing, but it's the same exact events in the same order from a different POV, told with a different narrative formula, even though everything else is identical. But it'll mean, for example, that an evening in which there's a banquet, and given the body language, the main female character realizes that the potential love triangle that's happening is in a different shape than she thought. That will be a long sequence in the shoujo version, and we get all the facial expressions, and we get a lot of her interior thoughts. And that'll be just flown through in like 3 pages in the boys version, but then the boys version will have a much more elaborate action sequence when the actual duel happens.
Right.
So that you can see from the pacing of the two, the expectations of what are shoujo readers going to want and what are shonen readers going to want, in which those readerships are known to both contain people of both male and female identifying readers.
And do people read both of them?
Sometimes, yes.
For the same story, I mean.
Sometimes, yes. Mostly not. It's a unique experiment. No one else has done a thing like that Escaflowne experiment.
Huh. What a neat experiment. What an interesting kind of thing to do, really. Yeah.
But I mean, but manga, as opposed to animation, gets made for all different age groups and demographics. So, for example, just glancing at the pile that was just returned to me and is sitting in front of me, here is Tramps Like Us, which is the US edition of what's called Kimi wa Petto, or You Are My Pet, is the other English translated title. And it's about a woman. She's an executive in an office. She's tall, she's high salaried, and she went to Harvard, but she's back in Japan. And she's facing the challenge of what is known in Japan as the 3 highs. The expectation that a woman wants to try to find and date and marry a man who is higher than her in 3 things: height, salary, and educational level. And that a woman is considered successful if she has achieved the 3 highs, and that otherwise the match will be uncomfortable. And so if you are a tall, Harvard-educated female executive, the percentage of the male population that you are culturally permitted to date is minuscule. And she has in fact found one, and she is dating a tall, well-educated doctor. But she strikes up a friendship with a short, underemployed male ballet dancer. And it becomes a complicated examination for her of, what do I really want? This friendship is being a lot more powerful for me than the sort of romance is, which feels like we're both going through the motions. And it's a deep examination of the pressures that are on a successful woman when choosing a person to be a partner with. Right? That is not aimed at 14-year-old girl readers. It is aimed at adult women. And that kind of title, or another that's sitting in front of me, is Sanctuary, which is a seinen title about a pair of brothers who are refugees, I think, from having been with their families in the Cambodian violence, anyway, Southern Pacific Rim, who come back to Japan as youths and determined to try to improve Japan politically. but realize that in order to get the power and influence to do so, they're going to have to work hard in coordination. And so they flip a coin, which one of them is going to be the politician and which one of them is going to try to work his way up as a mafia boss, as a yakuza. And so one of them enters into the criminal underground world and the other into the straight-laced politician world, concealing the fact that there's any link between them and working in parallel to try to garner enough power to institute political change to prevent Japan from being neutral in future massacres and genocides. And so it has a lot of political action and drama, but also a lot of gunning, gang violence drama. But it's also a very clearly adult set of topics. It's an example of a seinen title. And so these are absolutely marketed for adults and the kind of thing that would be a thriller novel or a romance novel or a chick lit. I mean, my description of Tramps Like Us, Joe, which genre of women's lit would that be if it were an American or British novel?
How old is the protagonist? Has she just come back from Harvard, or
I think she's in her late 20s, so that she's...
So it's probably chick lit. Romance has absolutely exploded all over the place into multiple incredibly specific subgenres, largely in the last 20 years and mostly since the prevalence of ebooks, because people can find what they want and not just what's in the shop.
Right. And so you can get really, really, really narrow to particular specializations and people can still buy it.
Right. Yeah. And I was astonished to discover this a few years ago when a novel of mine was nominated for the Romantic Times best novel in, I forget, either science fiction or fantasy, but they've got the number of categories they have is incredible. So there is, for instance, Scottish historical romance. There is Scottish historical fantasy romance. There's, I think there's also Scottish historical werewolf romance.
Right.
Separate. And that's just Scottish.
Right.
And then there are other countries and specialities as well. So it's incredibly specific. As I've discovered during the pandemic, it is perfectly possible to find sufficient romance novels in which the characters go to Italy and find love to read for a whole year, and I'm not out of them. It is specialized and it's out there, and this is all relatively new. I know what romance categories there were in the 80s and 90s, and all of this subgenre is now people can find it with the internet and particularly with ebooks. And also romance has always been a major seller within fiction, but it is now an even larger part of the market because people are less embarrassed buying it, particularly people who are not the traditional middle-aged white women readers of romance. Men and younger women and all kinds of people, all kinds of demographics. There are many, many now romance categories of non-white romance that are very, very interesting to see these kind of proliferating all over the place. But chick lit is not a category of romance, even though there's a romance always in it. And even though it's got the trope that anybody who's ever even heard of romance knows, which is that your female character will end up happily married. But chick lit is actually a mainstream genre that sells in mainstream and to many, many people and as bestsellers. And it emerged out of Bridget Jones's Diary, and Bridget Jones's Diary spawned chick lit, and now there's quite a lot of it. But it's not sold to the same people and in the same way, even apart from the fact that if you look at the covers, it's really obviously a different thing. But I decided at some point that I wanted to know what chick lit was. I'd read Bridget Jones's Diary, like
Mm-hmm.
everybody who read things had read Bridget Jones's Diary at the point when it came out. It was a phenomenon. But I wanted to see what chick lit was and what it was doing, so I read a bunch of it to see what it was as a genre and how it's different. And what it is that chick lit is about an older woman, usually in her 30s, but
Mm-hmm.
late 20s, might do it for your Harvard educated character in that story,
Mm-hmm.
who has had relationships
Mm-hmm.
and has a career,
Mm-hmm.
but the relationships are not cutting it, and neither is the career, and she isn't happy.
Mm-hmm.
So the plot of a chick lit novel will be that she usually starts off with a partner, but he's not the right partner.
Right.
And at the end, she will have a different partner. And often the same goes for career. They are
Mm.
often about midlife career changes.
Right.
And the thing that really makes it chick lit is that you need the career happy ending, which will sometimes be starting your own business, or sometimes it'll be a career change. In Emily Giffen's Something Borrowed, Something Blue,
Mm-hmm.
whichever one of them it is that I'm thinking of, I think it's Something Blue. It's moving to London, but doing the same job that she was doing in New York. It can be having a baby.
Right. But some major life change.
Yeah, major life change
Right.
that comes out of this. And they are much more realistic and much less wish fulfillment-y
Mm.
than category romance.
Right. Yeah. Thinking on the Josei manga that I've read, of which there's a lot, I would say that very few of them qualify in that direction because much more of them are either this is, yeah, there's been some dating, but this is the sort of first serious romance, though it's a post college
Mm-hmm.
romance. Or it'll be only slightly about romance because it'll be about this woman's career as a model, or it'll be about this woman's transition from being a singer to being an actress, without a romance in there at all. Or it'll be about these women's relationships with their mothers.
So when I was reading all of these romance novels set in Italy,
Mm-hmm.
because I was sad, and there was a pandemic, as you may have
Yes.
noticed, some of them, many of them in fact, had older protagonists who were in some cases divorced, or they'd had a relationship.
Mm-hmm.
And I was sort of thinking that they were maybe chick lit,
Mm-hmm.
but they absolutely weren't, because the career details were complete fantasy.
Right. Yeah, and there is a thing with romance where the career is just sort of because there has to be one to state, which I remember at one point when friends were talking about 50 Shades of Grey when it was in the midst of people's discussions in consciousness. And yeah, it was abstractly interesting to hear about what the field is doing and an unusual type of book getting a lot of attention. And then it was mentioned to me that she was a English Lit PhD student. And I found myself really wanting to know whether she finished her degree or whether she didn't and dropped it for romance. And it was like that suddenly made me actually slightly desire to read just to satisfy that thing, because the career is interesting to me, which of course speaks to I would enjoy the chick lit where the career is a focus, or indeed the josei where the career is often the central focus and there sometimes isn't a romance, more so than the romance where
Right.
the career is a side question.
So, for an example, one of the romance novels set in Italy has a character who is divorced, and she is working in a shop in England, and she is very underappreciated.
Hmm.
And she goes on holiday in Italy, and she not only does she meet an absolutely gorgeous Italian man and falls in love with him, but it turns out that her amazing ability to taste wine, that she's just, been drinking wine, but her amazing ability to taste wine and a knowledge of wine from looking at the shelves when she was stocking the shelves in the shop, bless her,
Hmm.
gives her the ability to work in a agriturismo vineyard place. They love her and they want her, and she is the heart and soul of this place because of this. And it's just like, this is not a career. This is not focus. It's just totally fantasy. It's
Yeah.
just wish fulfillment fantasy. And I love this book, by the way. I am not dissing this book
Hmm.
in any way in saying that it's fantasy. It's
Yeah.
filling a different role.
Mm.
But in chicklit, you'll have the details and it'll be realistic.
Right. Yeah. Whereas we all know from the mega best-selling manga Drops of God that you can't be brilliant at tasting wine unless you've undergone rigorous training and climbed up Tibetan monasteries on your knees to taste dirt from different bits of France to confirm that you can recognize the different terroirs of different areas
Yeah.
that grow grapes, and have a competition with your adopted brother where you have to figure out what wine somebody meant from their verbal description that it was similar to the Mona Lisa, down to not only which wine but which exact year,
Yeah,
from this
I think
ridiculous over
I
the
think
top
that's actually
wine
a
competition
bit
manga
more realistic, in fact.
that you have to put effort into becoming good at the thing. Yes. Well, and it's a good example of, that is a shonen, that is a, or on the seinen edge because they're actually adults, but that is a, competition. We're dueling. We're having a wine duel. They really do have these wine duels, and they have wine tasting duels, and go through the desert for their desperate wine training in order to be better at tasting wine, in order to fight each other. And the protagonist has a tortured background where his wine connoisseur father, when he was young, kept making him taste weird things like pencils and leather and so on,
What?
and never
What?
said why. And then when the guy became an adult and tasted wine for the first time, he had this brilliantly developed differentiable palate because his father had made him taste all these weird things, and he finally understood. But it was cruel because his father would never explain what the hell it was for. When he was young. And
Whoa.
so he hates wine because he hates his weird father, but also he's brilliant at wine. He's a natural wine genius, or a lifelong trained wine genius. Yep, but, but it's so ferociously competitive. And that's one of the neat things where sometimes you can see sort of two side-by-side iterations of almost the same story have a different style. So when you were describing chicklet, I was thinking of two recently published in English series, one of which is called Delinquent Housewife, and the other of which is called Way of the House Husband. And in both of them, the premise is that a person who was in a gang when younger is trying to give it up and make a life as a housewife or house husband due to falling in love with an excellent person and wanting that new situation. But in uh, Delinquent Housewife, it's all about her relationship, trying to develop a good relationship with her in laws. She and her husband have just married, and then he's gone overseas on a business trip and left her living with his mother and his brother and his sister. And it's all about the wife, the newlywed wife, trying to conceal the fact that she used to be the leader of a biker gang, and trying desperately to pretend that she has cooking skills, and pretend that she has a respectable job. She lies about having a job at one point just so that she has an excuse to go out of the house. And so it's all about family and wanting to develop this relationship and sort of being ashamed of this background, but then coming to terms with the background. Whereas the one where it's a man who's giving up having been in a gang, it's all about he was a super assassin, and so when he goes to the grocery store, he's like really scary and like punches all the cabbages to see which is the best one. And other former gang people periodically show up to try to duel him, and it's a comedy. Whereas the other one is very much I mean, it's not a romance because they're married, and it's a can I become ingratiate myself with the in-laws sufficiently to be approved of by my mother-in-law is what's at stake in the narrative. Also to be approved of by the younger sister, especially of the groom. So that it's exactly the same premise applied to two very different what we're doing with it. In one of them, it's the sort of comedic what happens when somebody from this world of violence enters into a world of nonviolence. And the other, it's the very serious can you transition into traditional feminine approval from having been part of a traditional counterculture space?
Yeah.
You know, those arcs both being very gendered. And typically for this type of thing, the sales of Way of the House Husband are way higher than the sales of Delinquent Housewife, and it has an animated adaptation, and Delinquent Housewife doesn't. But Delinquent Housewife is a fine series and was a success within its field, but Josei is much less commercially successful in general, and very, very rarely animated, and kind of uncommon in translation because something that has an anime will always sell better. One of the reasons being that when you have a hit Josei, you don't make an animated series out of it. Those are for teens and kids and the consumers of
Right.
that kind of show. You make a live action series. And so lots of these have live action series in Japan. But there isn't a big international consumption of Japanese live action the way there is of Japanese animation. I know there's been increase lately in consumption of Korean drama, and K-dramas are becoming a popular thing for people to watch streaming online, and some Japanese dramas are gaining in that direction. You know, so there is an adaptation of Tramps Like Us. It's just that it's live action, and so it's much harder to find because it's not aimed at that youth slash science fiction slash moe demographic that animation is aimed at. Which is why the breadth of topics of manga is just simply way wider than the breadth of topics of anime.
So I remember we were having a conversation once, and you said that there's always at least two manga about any given thing.
Yeah, is a good way to put it. And I mean, you know, there's multiple manga about competitive yo-yo, but there's also, you know, multiple deaf romance manga, and I have a shelf where I collect manga about Cesare Borgia. There are 7 of them, and they're very different from each other. And you know, one of them is all actiony and shonen and violent and full of boobs, and you know, another is really really sweet and romantic and focused on drawing Lucrezia's dresses in great detail. And another one is shonenai, which is to say a male homosexual romance narrative aimed at female readers. So it's about the romance between Cesare and his assassin Micheletto, so that it focuses on that romance as the center, but it's in a very female gaze oriented style, because there's female gaze oriented manga, and then there's male gay manga, and then there's male oriented male gay manga, which is a totally different thing. In the delightful manga Skullface bookseller Honda-san, which is an autobiographical comedy about working in a big bookshop in Japan and working in the manga and art book section specifically. So it has a lot of extremely detailed satirical stuff about the publishing industry, publicists, advertising, rules about which titles do or don't get a little insert card, how annoying it is when people come into the store and just take the little insert card out but don't buy the book. You know, it's a very, very geeky, you really have to care deeply about the book publishing industry to enjoy this, but if you do, it's amazing. Has an interesting and very telling moment when one thing that shop gets a lot of is American tourists and indeed tourists from Europe, which she'll depict, who are fans and will come to the shop, usually in a group of which only one speaks Japanese, but they're excited to find titles of manga that they aren't able to get a hold of. And she has this one story in it where this group of incredibly gorgeous, fashionable, tall, clearly European women with, intimidating piercings and purple hair that's gorgeously styled, who are all looking, incredibly stylish, but also very lesbian-y, come in and they say, where are the gay manga? And she points to this one tiny little shelf in the corner. And then is like, oh, but do you mean the gay manga for men or the gay manga for women? And they're like, well, the gay manga for women. She's like, oh, it's this entire wall. That there will be literally 100 times as many titles, which are a male homosexual romance written by a female author for a female consumer versus written by a male author for a male consumer with a very different style. But you've also made me think of another title that is sitting in the bunch in front of me, which is called Otomen, which is a good indicator of how one of the signatures of shoujo anime and shoujo manga, meaning the stuff that is oriented at younger female audiences, which will usually have a teen protagonist, is that one of its signatures is questioning and transgressing and messing with gender, often with fairy tale trappings as a sort of tool of the narrative. This is a genealogy within shoujo that was started by Tezuka's Princess Knight a long time ago, which is manga about a person called Sapphire who is born with a female body, but due to an error in heaven, both a male and a female kokoro, which is heart, but may better be translated in this context as soul, so that this person has two souls, and is born as the only kid of the king and queen in a country that doesn't allow female succession, but has an evil vizier who will inherit if there's no heir. So they raise Sapphire as a boy. And so Sapphire's normal demeanor is as a prince. But Sapphire also likes to run off and disguise as a princess and has romances with male partners as a princess, but also runs off in disguise as a swashbuckling sort of ne'er-do-well-y, rescue-y person, masked wanderer with a sword, known as the Ribbon Knight because of having a huge bow on his hat. And has different romances with female partners. And then the whole plot revolves around people trying to push Sapphire into being one gender or the other. And this, and then Rose of Versailles, which was written, so Princess Knight is 50s, 60s. Rose of Versailles is mid-70s, when there was a very important sort of feminist, women moving a lot more into the world of manga. And one of the figures there, Ryoko Ikeda, did Rose of Versailles, which is inspired by Princess Knight, but takes place during the historical French Revolution. And the main character, Oscar, is the youngest daughter of a French noble family that usually supplies the captain of the royal guard, except they have no sons. And after girl after girl after girl, the father just can't take it anymore and says, okay, this one we're raising is a boy, no matter what. And so Oscar is female-bodied but raises a boy, and then becomes the captain of the royal guard, meaning captain in charge of protecting Marie Antoinette when she arrives. And this too has Oscar torn between male identity and female identity, and have romantic interests who are female to the male persona and romantic interests that are male to the female persona in a complicated back and forthy kind of way. This stimulated a tradition within manga, because these were both mega bestsellers, of Stuff for Girls is very interested in having a tomboyish girl who behaves like a prince, or a effeminate boy who is happier in the other direction, in ways that edge on and are in dialogue with transness and questions of trans identity, but often are very much not engaged with that, but much more engaged with these being tropes. And right now, manga is in the process of sort of the dialogue about that and the dialogue about real lived trans experience merging with each other in complicated ways. But the one lying in front of me is called Otomen, and it is the result of, and one of the manifestations of that combination. So Otomen, otoko is a woman, so it's the beginning of the word woman stuck onto other, and it means a man who has traditionally feminine hobbies. A man who likes cooking and baking adorable little pastries and cookies that are shaped like a bear. Or a man who enjoys sewing cute little teddy bears, or just sewing at all. Or a man who is interested in makeup, or a man who consumes shoujo, who consumes material intended for girls, because as one might imagine, there's much less stigma both in the US and in Japan for a woman to consume male-oriented material than for a man to consume female-oriented material. So the series is about a bunch of teenage boys in school who have traditionally feminine hobbies, but are in their actual sexual attractions straight, trying to navigate this and trying to navigate that. Do you hide it? Do you consider yourself ashamed of it, etc.? So one of them aspires to be a professional makeup artist when he grows up and is very good at and skilled with and knowledgeable about makeup. Another one is drawing shoujo manga under a female pseudonym. And the protagonist is even more interesting because he's into cooking and baking and sewing, as which are, fun but traditionally very femme-coded hobbies, especially in Japan. However, his mother is super, super determined to get him to be masculine as possible. And we rapidly learn that the reason for this is that his father is trans and came out as trans after the birth of the son, and the couple separated as a result. And the woman who his father now is, she is a lovely woman, but it meant that his mother was left with a deep, deep, deep anxiety. We might articulate it as a transphobic anxiety, but a deep anxiety that her son would do the same thing. And so he is hyper anxious about concealing this from his mother because he's afraid she'll think that he's either going to be gay or going to be trans. She's very confused about the relationship between these two things, whereas he feels like he's straight and he's interested in the girl who is the heroine, but that he likes these feminine things and wants to do them. And how do you triangulate that? There's this amazing page where partway through where he's trying to force himself to read Shonen Jump, and it's open to like this page and there's explosions and ninjas punching each other, and it's so exactly the ridiculous action sequences of Shonen Jump. And the look on his face of just like, I gotta grin and bear it, I gotta read this, it's boy manga, I have to read boy manga, is just so powerful of, oh, it's okay, just read the manga that you like. It's a really neat and complex set of triangulation. So there's romance in it between him and the tomboyish heroine, but it's also very much about what is transness versus what is feminine coded hobby versus what is homosexuality. None of these things is the same as the other, but all of them are tangled in the imaginations of a lot of people, and especially in the prejudices and teasing angles of teenage classmates.
Yeah, that sounds amazing.
But it's not atypical for how complex the gender stuff can be that's going on in shoujo manga. Now, some of it is a lot simpler, like it's sitting on the floor next to Bride of Deimos, which is about a girl who lives in a very gothic world, and Satan is in love with her and wants her to marry him. And she says, no, I shun you. And he says, it's okay, I'll wait, because she lives in a horror universe. And so every single issue is like, random giant enormous evil spider has showed up and possessed her friends and then eaten them. But she was protected by Satan, so she's fine. And he's just like, I'm immortal, I'll keep waiting. Eventually you'll get so tired of watching all of your friends be murdered by monsters and realizing that the only way to not be murdered by monsters is to agree to be my bride, and meanwhile I'll just hang out. It's really fascinating and strange little gothic romance, and isn't doing deep examination of gender. It's very straightforwardly just a romance, even though he is quite effeminate and beautiful. um, so some of it is doing deep five-way gender complications. Some of it is merely being gendered by having romance in it.
That one also is interesting in that it's using Satan,
Yes.
and so sort of Christian mythology.
Yeah, but very much treating it as mythology. And in fact, the reason he's after her is she's the reincarnation of his ancient beloved Aphrodite. You're like, okay, sure. Yes, those are both European mythological figures. They definitely belong in the same story with each other. Sure, that's totally fine. One of the things I think is really neat about reading Japanese fantasy is seeing it when it's set in Europe or using European stuff, be sort of clumsy and mixy and wrong and weird about it in the same way that clumsy Western fiction set in Europe, or sorry, set in Asia will be. And so you get to experience sort of backwards what it feels like to have somebody who really only knows the Wikipedia surface trappings of your culture use that to set a story there, and it sometimes works and sometimes goes way off the rails. So yeah, Satan and Aphrodite, who are ancient lovers, and but then she was cursed or something, I forget, so that she has to be reincarnated over and over. So it's got Satan and Aphrodite and reincarnation. Oh, right. Lauren just reminded me. It's because they're siblings. And so that's a forbidden romance. Forbidden romance because they're siblings, Satan and Aphrodite. Little known fact. And that's why they're not allowed to be together. And it's also why he was cast down into hell for the crime of incest. That's right. But the sweet Victorian schoolgirl who Aphrodite has been reincarnated as, well, it's nothing to do with him, and she shuns him. And one of the really fun things in that one is that it was published by a publisher that knew it was going to be somewhat niche at the time of its release, and so was a lot more direct in letting you see some of the differences between language use between English and Japanese in the translation, specifically of sound effects. Because Japanese has a lot of words that are the accepted sound effect of a particular thing to which we don't ascribe a sound. So, for example, when a dog barks, the sound is bark to us, or maybe ruff, ruff, right?
Mm-hmm.
And to a Japanese person, the sound is wan, wan. And, both of those sound about the same amount like the noise a dog actually makes. It's just that the culture has a particular word that is that sound. But Japanese has a lot of words which are words for the sound of a thing that we don't think of as having a sound, that are the distinctive sound of that thing. The distinctive sound of the clock hitting the new hour, even though but it's not tick, it's like time moved, the sound effect. Or the particular sound effect some of these are things that do have sounds like water dripping or leaves rustling, but there's a sound effect of turning your head suddenly to look at something. And it has a prescribed word, just like the prescribed word for a dog's bark noise. The closest I can think of in English is actually within Marvel Comics, where Bamf is the sound Nightcrawler makes when he teleports. And nothing else makes the sound Bamf. Only that thing makes the sound Bamf. And it's always Bamf. And similarly, when Wolverine puts his claws out, it makes the sound snicked. And nothing else makes the sound snicked. And everybody can imagine to themselves what snicked sounds like. And when they went to make the movies, they were like, what shall we have the snicked sound be? But that it's a word that corresponds to a particular thing. So there's a word for the sound of turning away from somebody in disgust, which to us doesn't have a sound.
Right.
But in this, they translate that sound effect as shun. Shun is the sound effect, the sound of turning away from someone in the act of refusal. And it's a very cool way to be made aware that different languages can have different approaches to what we think of as having a sound word and what we think of as not having a sound word. Cows moo, horses neigh, deer don't have a sound word.
Marmots whistle.
Yes.
That was a kid's sound book thing, in which we all discovered that marmots whistle.
Right. Yeah. And so to very briefly do it, the other three shoujo that I have sitting in front of me briefly, one of them is Bride's Story, which is about a woman in a happy arranged marriage in a Mongolia-ish tribe on the Silk Road in the 19th century, at the point that China and Russia are starting to try to secure the borders, and nomad culture is getting sort of weaker, but she doesn't yet realize that. But it's focused on arranged marriage, and her arranged marriage, and her mother-in-law's arranged marriage, and her friends' arranged marriages, and depicted positively, not negatively. These are all enthusiastic and successful arranged marriages, with also a deep interest in textiles and the work that the women do sewing and hunting and the work that the men do butchering cattle and so on. And so a lot of it is about gender, gendered labor, gendered behavior, gendered spaces acting differently at different points as you travel on the Silk Road. But it's all about gender in a very non-gender transgressy way, in a very gender reinforcey way, a very binary way. Whereas Ottoman is about like crisscrossy all the time, but they're both equally interested in gender. And then the other one is Sugar Sugar Rune by Moyoko Ano, which is a kind of a deconstruction of Magical Girl formula, which has a teenage girl with magical powers, usually attending school. And in this one, they come from the witch dimension and they have to go through to the human dimension to gather hearts, which are the fuel for their magic. And you sort of level up by gathering more hearts. But you gather the hearts by making humans fall in love with you and then ripping the emotion center out of them.
Ugh.
And so it's cute and sparkly and has all the trappings of fun thing that you would imagine being a very wholesome thing for 14-year-old girls to read about, but it has this interestingly, wait a minute, this is kind of deeply unethical. Yeah, and humans, as it narrates, can regenerate their emotion center. You'll rip it out, but then it'll develop anew. And it can, you sort of rip out that day's amount or the current stuff, whereas they have only one, and if theirs ever gets ripped out, that's it. So it's very much about, all of this style of manga is very much about the glitter and the magic and the attractiveness and the awesome outfits that the magical girl gets to wear. But what about the effect that those have? Because all of those things are about luring the gaze. And even though these are written for a female gaze, if you really wore that, it would be very male gazy targeted. What are you doing? Well, are you thinking through the way this is manipulating the male people who are around the female person, or indeed the female people who might be attracted to the female person? So those are sort of typical versions of shoujo, which is to say they're looking at genderedness, but the degree to which they're looking at heteronormative versus homosexual versus binary versus non-binary is extremely variable.
Yeah, and also very much from a very different culture in a really interesting way.
Do you have other thoughts about sort of that type of teen magic title? I know you don't engage with it that much in the US. Although teen magic is, I think, one of the few magic formulae that in the US is associated with Japanese stuff. Sort of people recognize that as being a import trope focused thing to some extent.
I mean, there's a lot of it in YA as well.
Yeah, it's very YA. And I think hard sometimes about the degree to which we can and can't compare shonen and shoujo to YA, because in some sense they are. That's the theoretical demographic, and in some sense they're similar in that lots of adults read them, and sometimes, in fact, a YA book is mostly being read or even mostly being marketed for adults, but it's YA because YA is a formula and a structure, not necessarily the actual readership.
Yeah.
Which is true, I think, of a lot of shoujo and shonen as well. Everyone knows that
Yeah.
these are being read by people at older ages, but it's a formula of what types of issues will be at stake, what questions are going to be being asked.
Yeah, I think that is very, very parallel, in fact. And you would say that YA is being read by people of that age group, but in fact, everybody knows that a lot of adults also read it.
Mm-hmm. And that the marketing of it includes both is a good way to put it. It's not as if there's someone sitting there marketing a shonen title saying, no teenager will ever like this shonen title. It will be only read by older audiences. But lots of them are being made for those mixed audiences. And so in the same way that in shonen you get fan service aimed at men and fan service aimed at women, and sometimes you get literal alternation. It's an anime, not a manga, but Gundam Seed has alternating shower shots where it'll be a man in the shower in one episode and a girl in the shower the next episode and a boy in the shower the next episode, girl in the shower the next episode.
What I just wanted to say before we get away from it,
Mhm.
there were special, we call them the Muggle editions of the
Right.
Harry Potter books with covers that made them look more grown up because there was sufficient adult readership that it was worth doing it
Mhm.
to give them these books that made them look more sophisticated and grown up.
Yeah. And that you wouldn't be ashamed of reading on the
Yeah,
train.
exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah,
And I think book covers are sometimes purchased for that reason, that you can cover up the outside of the thing and then no one can tell what
yeah.
genre your book is or what medium
And
your manga is.
and again with the e-reader and the explosion of romance, nobody can see what you're reading when you're reading on an e-reader.
Yeah.
There's no betraying cover.
Which has, I think, made a lot in every genre, made it much easier for people who, for whatever reason, would feel pressure to not read that genre.
Mm-hmm.
Whether it's too old or too young or too male or too female or too light or too whatever. That in every demographic of printed media, one of the effects of the e-reader has been to increase the sales to whatever demographics felt cultural pressure to not read that thing before. Which is fascinating because
Yeah,
the net effect is to make the targeting of every genre almost less specific, but also more specific. Because your
yeah,
target is no longer women of this age, your target is now people who want Scottish romance.
yeah,
And that, narrower in one sense in terms of taste, but actually broader in terms of who it is of age and gender identification.
yeah. Yeah, it's fascinating, and it's fascinating to see that happening. And the only downside is I no longer get to see a lot of what people are reading when I'm on the metro.
Mm. Yeah,
Because
it's
it
true.
used to be that you could just sort of look and you'd sort of see people reading things, and you had a sort of survey of what was being read today on a commute. And now there is much less of that. And of
Mm-hmm.
course, the thing then for me was I would see somebody and they'd be reading like Patricia McKillip or something, and I would grin at them because,
Mm-hmm.
I like that book.
Yes.
Whereas now I don't know, but I think on the whole it's a very good thing.
Yeah, I mean, I'm remembering when a friend of mine was on a subway reading a very good and very intelligent, well-written anti-bullying manga called Great Teacher Onizuka, but that has a lot of over-the-top stuff in it, and turned the page to a two-page spread where some students were bullying each other by pulling each other's skirts down and then burying their underwear and doodling on each other's butts, and all of this was to then be set up like how we're teaching these kids why this is not okay. But the friend heard a gasp over their shoulder and turned, and there was a nun right there on the subway. It's like, how do you explain? No, it's a really wholesome manga, I promise. Which it is.
Yes,
Yes, the subway is a challenge. All right, well, this has been a very fun conversation. I think we should stop.
we'll just do the boring bit.
I think we just need to do the formula bit.
Yeah. This podcast is released under a Creative Commons Attribution, Non-Commercial, No Derivatives International 4.0 license.
And you can find our stuff, support the podcast, and get early episodes at patreon.com/Ada Palmer, and support Jo and her great poetry at patreon.com/BlueJo.
And you can find us on Twitter and our books and things at joewaltonbooks.com and adapalmer.com. So until next time, ex urbe ad astra.
Ad Astra.